Hello, PSI2000 students. We're back for week 13 on interest groups and social movements. One of the major areas of study within political science is the study of interest groups, because in modern democratic societies, interest groups are such a major factor in trying to have a relationship between commercial interests or other interests in society and the way the government operates, either through its democratic bodies or through its bureaucracy. So at any given time, there will be virtually hundreds of interest groups operating to influence the government on a very wide range of issues. Some of them will be commercial issues, some of them will be social issues like anti-poverty groups, anti-drunk driving groups, animal welfare groups, environmental groups, labor safety groups, all the way to trade groups, to commercial, commerce groups of various kinds. Will constantly be trying to influence the government to try to turn policy or to modify policy in a direction that's more consistent with their objectives. Now, in the past, these the interest group activities have sort of constantly increased to the point where governments or other stakeholders began to be a little bit concerned about who was influencing government, how, when, and whether that was resulting in sort of a favoritism within government on how government decisions were made. So over time, governments have brought in various ways of controlling interest group activity. For example, in Canada, we have what's called our interest group registry, administered by Industry Canada, so that people can know who is lobbying the government for what reasons and how. But of course, depending upon the nature of the interest group, the tactics they will use to try to influence government will vary quite considerably. A very well-funded, powerful commercial interest, like the Business Council on National Issues, as it used to be called, and so on, will conduct a lot of their lobbying behind closed doors in personal relationships and through the use of various mechanisms that come from the influential position they have in controlling companies, therefore jobs, therefore a concern for politicians, and so on, as opposed to less well-funded groups, like, for example, like environmental groups or labor protection groups or anti-poverty groups, who don't have the same direct contacts with the government, or won't have the same influence from the point of view of the fact that they control large companies and therefore control jobs. So their tactics will be slightly more public. They will try to influence public discourse through releasing studies or through protests or through letter writing campaigns and things like that. So the nature of the interest group and what its capacities are have a lot of impact on its strategies, on how it tries to influence the government. But all interest groups are basically identifiable organizations. Whereas that you can contrast that with social movements, which tend not to be identifiable organizations so much as an identifiable point of view or position on a social issue that's held in common more loosely by a wide swath of the public. And so a social movement, for example, like concern about the environment that occurred in the early days of the environmental movement, or a social movement around women's rights that occurred in the earlier incarnation. Now, many of these movements then become formalized and become represented by interest groups, but social movements themselves have a tendency to occur as a broad set of common beliefs or wishes of the population that influence government across a wide spectrum of people talking to their MPs, of direct action, sit-ins, any types of other protests that do occur. Now, as those become more established, they tend to take on a more organized form in terms of interest groups, but they start off as something quite different in terms of broad social movements. And I think that it's important to understand the distinction between these two things. But one thing that can never be that should never be lost on the student is that interest groups are a major factor in our governance virtually every day by the hundreds. There's always somebody in Ottawa or in any provincial capital lobbying on a wide range of issues on any given day. And understanding the impacts of these interest groups on government policy is a very important consideration. Social movements needs to be understood in sort of a broader concept, and perhaps even over a longer period of the historical period of time. For example, like I said, the environment movement or the gender equality movement, or things like that, or the gay movement, things that try to change the outlook of how the society views the issue generally, and try to create changes in the understanding of the broad population. Which is quite a different, and then that change impacts government over time, particularly as these social movements become more formalized in terms of the way they represent specific policy positions to government. Two different sets of issues, but two highly relevant considerations for political scientists as they look at what are the factors that influence government decision making. So in your reading, think about that. Think about the types of interest group activities, their strategies, and how those contrast with social movements, and try to identify in your own mind how various social movements evolve and the ways that they influence broad public opinion, therefore indirectly influence government going forward. Okay, and we'll talk to you again next week.